In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together in this Easter season. Grateful to be back together, seeking to learn more about you and your church. We ask that you help us to, especially today, appreciate the beauty of our faith, of our tradition, the culture that's been handed on to us, so that we can be good stewards of these many treasures. And we ask all these things as we pray for the intercession of Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, as I said, I'm a little less pulled together on this as I'd like. I think some of it's just going to be filled in a little bit, somewhat anecdotally. The thing that I'm very grateful for is that I spent 5 years in Italy and Europe. So a lot of this is not theoretically, like, I'm not pointing to churches that I just have seen pictures of, but I've walked in these churches, I've prayed in them, seen these works of art. And so, that's why I figured it would be good to try and at least get a good number of slides so that we can kind of walk through this. I think I have like 80 slides, but to me, that's not. I think when I'm done with this presentation, when I get it where I want it, it will probably be at least double that. So because I kind of know what anyway. So, as you might imagine, Christianity didn't begin with a lot of art. At least not any that we really know about. And a lot of that was, it's kind of hard to display works of art when you're under threat of persecution. There were no really churches that were public churches, certainly for the first 3 centuries. And of course, churches would be a primary place where you would see the arts. But of course, even in that kind of, we would maybe call it a silent, artistically or aesthetically silent period, we know that because of what happened later, that there were certain, like for example, when my brother was talking about chant, we see lineage that comes from the Jewish tradition that carries into early Christian chant. Now, we don't have written record of it until much, much later, but it's kind of one of these things where even if you can't connect the dots, if you see something here and then it pops up again over here, you say, well, there must be something in between. So it's interesting, though, if you're trying to find kind of the earliest artwork, you go many times to catacombs, right? Some of the most ancient art in Christian art is to be found in catacombs. And you can imagine kind of like in a catacomb that could be, you can decorate down there because it's a little less likely. Not as many people are going to be down there, and but even in the catacombs, you see that. Here's another picture of a catacomb. This is a catacomb that the way you'd see it now. I don't know how many of you have been to catacombs? Yeah, some of you. So the way you'd see them now is like this. These are all the niches where it's now sometimes it wouldn't have been single body. Sometimes multiple deceased family members over time would be buried in the niches. Well, when they were vacated, they pulled, and there were some of these were they all probably would have had like marble, kind of like if you went and looked at niches today, right, in a cemetery, marble plaques over them. But the marble was stolen, or they basically took all of the remains and interred them at a later period, and then the marble was repurposed in a lot of these places. So what you see then is this is that bare tufa. The tufa being that in certain parts of around Rome, in the outskirts of Rome, it's a cool material because it basically is soft until it's exposed to the air, and then it hardens. So it's kind of perfect for making subterranean. I don't know. Like this is St. Priscilla, which is really probably the more ancient. There are a whole bunch of different catacombs around Rome.
So how old is this one, like, suspected to be?
First century. Obviously the first, second century. Then over time, I forget when they really didn't last very long. In terms of how long people were using them, I think, I don't want to mislead you, but I don't think they were being used actively to bury people much further than like 4th, 5th, or 5th, 6th century. And it's interesting. So, for example, St. Peter's body was initially buried at the Vatican Hill, right, in the cemetery, the Vatican Acropolis. But then they were worried that it was going to get robbed, so they moved it into the catacomb at one point and then moved it out. So there was also a lot of moving of bodies and remains around. St. Paul, same kind of thing. So you often had kind of, but I think it's interesting. These all went into, like, nobody even kind of really knew they were there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then they really only in the more modern era, 19th century, they started really, archaeology became a whole thing. And so now that all of a sudden you had archaeologists going back and discovering all of these ancient drawings and ancient catacombs and whatnot. One of the neat things at St. Priscilla is this is the earliest known depiction of Mary. I think they think sometime between 250 and 300 is in the catacombs of St. Priscilla. So it's, and you kind of get a sense, right, of it, but what's hard sometimes is that this is also St. Priscilla. So in this, we got the Good Shepherd, but in many respects, Jesus is portrayed a lot like Zeus would have been portrayed at the time. And so sometimes there was an attempt to kind of depict Christian themes in a way that if you didn't know it was Christian, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pick up on it in the 3rd century. So again, this is like 250 to 300 sometime in the 3rd century. So, if somebody's like going after you, it's just Zeus, kind of like. But so there was you see, there's another thing you see a lot of is what we call graffiti. I didn't get a chance to pull examples of that together, but you'll see a lot in the catacombs. If you go, I don't know if you've been able to make a Scavi tour. If you ever go to Rome, a Scavi tour or the excavations tour under St. Peter's. You have to make a reservation in advance, but in the area so they did excavations under the tomb of St. Peter to see if it was really on. I mean, the tradition was that the main altar under the baldacchino, it was directly over the tomb of St. Peter. So, because they had built the high altar of the current basilica over the previous altar of the Constantinian Basilica of St. Peter, and that was, by tradition, built over the grave. During the pontificate of Pius XII, they started doing these excavations during the Second World War. And so they were like digging around under there. And anyway, they got in and they found, it looked like basically it had been an old necropolis, an old burial ground with the kind of, the Roman burial grounds almost looked like cities. The necropolis, it looked like a little city. Romans had a tradition of coming in on feast days. They would come, gather, share a meal, and pour libations into the graves of their, they'd share a meal with their deceased relatives. So often it was kind of like a park or a picnic area, kind of like your cemetery was kind of it had a social function as well. But on the Vatican necropolis, they had kind of, when they put in the Constantinian Basilica on the site, they had kind of just cut the whole thing off, kind of plowed all these graves down, and then just put the basilica on top of it. And so they found in this one area, and they found some graffiti that said, Petrus, it was like, I think, Peter is here, or it's like, I think that's what it said. I can't remember exactly. But there were like all these scrawlings, and it looked like there was like a little, kind of a little niche where people like would put their prayer requests into the grave. So they found this kind of like really kind of neat archaeological evidence, and then ended up anyway, it's a bit off topic from art and architecture, but it was really fascinating. They found bones of a first century Palestinian man, but no bones of his feet. And they're like, why are there no feet? Why are there no bones of the feet? And then they said, well, he was crucified upside down. They had to remove his body quickly. They must have cut his body off from the feet and just buried him, left the feet on the cross. So it's kind of interesting. So there's pretty good archaeological reason to believe that these were the actual bones of Peter, and really over his grave. So that was interesting I had a whole class on that. Actually, it was an elective. It was actually the guy who had one of the Jesuits who had led some of these. It was crazy. He was telling us all the inside story on this stuff. But so it was cool. But you see, what you notice in a lot of the early Christian art is it basically takes up Roman styles. Now, of course, the Romans stole a lot of their stuff from the Greeks, right? The Romans they weren't particularly original. So they took a lot from the Greeks. And you see kind of a lot of those themes. If you, and we'll kind of look back at it. One of the really neat, so in 1930, in 31, a French-American team of archaeologists in Syria discovered a church house. It's really, so again, this is the time before they could build churches. And basically, it was a private home. It's the Church of Oropos. They excavated and kind of you can see where this cuts off is basically what's left archaeologically. And they were able to pull together, because they found Christian symbols and art in this church. Kind of this assembly area, teaching area, baptistry, courtyard. And so basically a private home that had been converted into a church and was used for worship. This is the remains of the baptistry. There are, I don't have the zoomed in, but you can see, I think this is, see there's a piece of the boat. I think that, anyway, I'm forgetting exactly what the themes are and I can't recognize them here, but they're Christian themes that are depicted in this baptistry that they found. Here's another, this is from that same house church in Dourouropos. Now, I don't know if these might be frescoes. You can see they're pretty damaged, right? And I'm not sure if they date back to 3rd century, 4th century time frame, but because this is the hard thing sometimes is you have churches that these are not museums that are stuck in time, right? It's not like somebody built. We have this thing now where you build a church, you do this huge capital campaign, you finish everything. The architect basically has this insane plan all the way down to the little detail of how the whole thing is supposed to all look and all work and all fit together. And then after you're finished, you're supposed to get it done in 5 years. And then, God forbid, you change anything because that architect is going to haunt you in your grave or something, or from the grave or something, because it's all kind of, there's a lot of self-expression in the artistic kind of paradigm that's become part of the modern reality. But if you look at so much of our Christian artistic heritage, you can't find who did it. You have a hard time knowing when they did it because people are just, it's like somebody was just coming in and, I can do this. I'm going to add this part. And you're not exactly sure what the date is. So some of it is very speculative in terms of, especially in this early time period, when you're trying to get a handle on when they were created. This sarcophagus, actually, if you're going on a Scavi tour in St. Peter's, you see this. And it's a neat sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, so 4th century, and you can see kind of like Adam and Eve, right? You have Christ teaching in the temple. Some of these scenes are easier to recognize than others. I don't know. But what's interesting is you can see this style is very Roman, right? Very, very Roman. And that would have been typical in that time, is that Christians, early on were very much inheritors of, and it's not like there was a particular style of Christian art. They took up the style of their particular time, and they began to depict Christian themes, biblical themes, in the style of the Roman Empire at that time. And you see the Chi-Rho is one of the more ancient symbols of Christianity, right? The Alpha and the Omega. A lot of people, there's debate on what it stands for, because so we think it's the first 2 letters of Jesus' name, right? So Christos would be Chi-Rho, Omega, and then whatever. But sometimes others, there are other interpretations of it as well. But I think from what I've seen of scholars, that it's the first 2 initials of Jesus' name. Any questions? Just kind of on this early period. You can imagine as well. There's not a lot of money. There's a lot of persecution, and there's also, it takes a lot of organization and a lot of resource. It takes generations to get even artists that are able to create beautiful art. When we'll get further along, when you get into the Renaissance, these are not artists that just kind of came out of nowhere. Many times they came, their father, Michelangelo's father was a sculptor. So it's like they learn this thing, like they're learning it the way that our kids now are learning, like football or hockey from the age of like 5. They're sitting there with like a little mini chisels, like chiseling marble at the age of 5. So it was like, it was in their, like, right from the very beginning. As soon as they could like walk, they were like learning these things, and to great effect. So after the legalization of Christianity, Constantine begins to build churches, and you begin to see, like, for example, St. Peter's, the first basilica, was built by Constantine on the Vatican Hill. This is one of the older churches. It's actually a St. Costanza is it's one of the best preserved buildings from late antiquity left in Rome. It was built by Constantine as a funerary hall. And there, in the Vatican Museum, actually, there are porphyry sarcophagi in the Vatican Museum that are massive, that were originally in this church. I think that it's thought that his 2 daughters, or 1 or 2 of them, were originally laid to rest in this mausoleum, and it's kind of in a circular. It has a circular design, which would not have been as typical. It's also built over part of the catacombs of St. Agnes, and so you see this as well, that there's, now you start having, so what, here's St. Peter's buried in the Vatican necropolis cemetery. What do they do? They come in, and it's a strange thing if you think about it, right? Here's where the saint's buried, build a church on it. I don't know if that would be like you can see that this is a very oddly Christian thing to do, right? It's like, we're going to build churches over the place where we've buried people. Why? Because they're holy, right? Because there's not just anybody, but over the primary saints. We want to pray to them and ask their intercession and honor them. So you see that beginning to happen. I think there was also a baptistry that was in that area as well. This is one of in the ambulatory. These are really very old. I believe they're mosaic. I think these might be frescoes. But again, you can see this is very Roman, right? Very kind of classical. Even today, I think people would associate this kind of art as kind of like Mediterranean art, right? And it's not, notice, there are no real Christian themes, right? So it's kind of, it's decorated in a pretty, although, maybe these are mosaics. I put mosaic there. I must have found that somewhere. I think they might be mosaics. they're a lot more impressive if they're mosaic. That's a lot more impressive as a mosaic, right? Yeah, I wrote that, but now I'm questioning myself. So I know I wrote that, but you'll see. Now this is in it. So this is Santa Sabina, and this church is one of the more ancient churches as well. This was very old, and this is the basilica style, right? This is like classic basilica style church. One of the things that's kind of interesting is you can see here that it's pretty simple, right? Well, it wasn't always. They came in and Baroqueified it, as they Baroqueified pretty much everything in Rome. But in recent years, they came and this is one of the churches, they stripped off a lot of the Baroque ornamentation to bring it back to what would have been more. And there's a big battle going on, or at least there was in Italy when I was there, because they were even like, there were pagan temples, for example, that had been taken over by Christians and then made into churches, and they add all kinds of Christian ornamentation and other things. And so there were some archaeologists and others who said, we want to go back and restore the original. So they want to like take out all of the Christian ornamentation, everything else, to get back to the original look. And then, of course, the Christians, some of the Catholics, it's a battle even within the Catholic Church. Some of them saying, hey, this like attempt to go back and see the original, that's not, why do we need to, like, what are we trying to do here? Are we running museums, or are we, like, this is a church. One of the areas where this big debate going back and forth would be at, for example, the Pantheon in Rome, which is the Church of All Saints, but also they pulled a lot of the ornamentation off that had been added over. Now, I think what happened there too, the whole ceiling of the Pantheon was bronze, and then they took it all out in the 16th century, melted it down and made it into the ball. So there's been a lot of like repurposing stuff. You can see, and a lot of the if you go back, this was built by the looks of it from scratch. Now, if I had time, if you go to Santa Maria in Trastevere, you'll find every column is different, because they took them all from different pagan temples. So you see that at different times too, where they all have different capitals. And that's kind of a neat thing. The Christians were not, it's very clear, they weren't a cult that was just like, had its own style. Right? That wasn't what was going on. They're like, oh, that's pretty. Let's put that in the church. This is a beautiful temple. And they weren't particularly superstitious either, if you think about it. Right? I mean, you think it wasn't very. I was just. There's a series on Amazon Prime on David, King David, and I was trying. I just wanted to see what it was like. But anyway, it was back when David went and raided the Amalekites, and he took some of their stuff back, and it was when God had placed the ban on it, said don't touch any of their stuff, don't take any of their things back, he's going to curse you. Well, he took it back, and that was the end of that. He was done, and then Samuel goes and anoints David, right? When Saul does that. So that's not the Christian. Christians are like, well, I don't know if they said, I don't even know if they used holy water, but they went right in and they're just, well, we're going to just, and you see this a lot of the time with these different churches in Rome. San Clemente, there's a church on a church, so you go to the church and then you can go down to the church, the older church that's underneath it. That's the foundations that are still there. And then you can go under that, And there's the remains of the temple that was under that. So you have this is a place people are used to worshiping God. We'll just put the church here. So there's not a sense of being contaminated, right? You wouldn't, and similarly, this is the basilica style is the architecture of the court. If you were to go to court in Rome in the first centuries, you'd go into a building that looked like this. This is where the judge would sit and hear cases. So it was a public assembly space. It wasn't like they made up this architecture so that it would suit Christian worship. It was adopted. It was what was, they said, well, these buildings are beautiful. They're practical. They work well. They should be churches. So, and this is another example of, these are pretty ancient, St. Cosmas and Damian, also in Rome. These, you can't see them very well. I'd like to get it closer, but these sheep I was like looking at, they're kind of cool. And these are all beautiful mosaics. Again, now this is what you start to see, but you won't. I was in Rome for the first year. Then you go on summer assignment, and the parish I went to for the first summer was Longostrino, which is in the northern part of Italy. It's kind of it's not too far from Ravenna. I'd never heard of Ravenna. I don't think a lot of us have. What I didn't realize is Ravenna is one of the it's a location of one of the most beautiful ancient Christian mosaics of a Byzantine kind of style in the world, hands down. And I remember the priest had taken me there to look at them. And it's crazy, right? So you're looking up, right? Here are the columns. San Vitale it's just crazy.
Yeah. Can I tell you something?
Yeah.
I landed there when it was actually being used for service. They were elevating elevating someone to sainthood and a bishop to sainthood, and they were having a service, and the place was filled with incense and I was just like, how did this happen? It was just stunning.
Yeah.
Because they don't use it very much for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just so incredible. Just a chance to get to see it as it should have been used.
Right.
You don't get
what it was built for.
It doesn't happen very often when you go looking at churches.
Yeah, although I will say I wouldn't be surprised if there was Sunday Mass there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So what was going on that this ended up being built there? Do you know?
Ravenna became in that time period, 6th century. Ravenna, Bologna, even like Ferrara, some of these towns that was a real strong agriculture. What's the name of the river that goes through there?
Ravenna was the seat of the last Roman emperor.
Correct. It was, so the gravity kind of shifted north and into that. It was very agriculturally rich, and also you had ties. It was on the Adriatic, so you had strong shipping to the east. You remember when Constantine kind of, in that time, the west was really, the east was where the strength was, right? The gravity of the Roman Empire kind of shifted to the east with Constantine. The west started getting really inundated by the northern barbarians and whatnot, and was really kind of collapsing in many respects. And you even can see it to a degree in that there's a lot of Byzantine influence on the architect. So, and you can, beautiful, right?
Yeah. Send us the slide deck so we can use it as our
I know,
TV back.
Yeah. Yeah, they're just, I don't know what it is about there's something just very simple, and yet there's a kind of organic feel to this style of really kind of primitive Byzantine art. It's not childish, but it has a certain childlike quality to it.
It's clean, yeah.
But it's got dignity. It's not. I don't know how to put it exactly. What I love about it too is rich colors, right? Like very just. It's not, but it's not overdone. It's not like. There's a kind of simplicity to it as well. It's a really beautiful style. And actually, if you're not particularly good at art, this is one of the easiest styles to emulate. Because you can see there's a lot of redundant pattern, and kind of it's very iconic. You can see how iconography spawned from this. So really, this predates iconography. So we don't really see iconography until 6th century. And so this is really kind of what, there's a kind of distillation into very, like even if you look at how these plants or other, different figures are depicted, there's a, they're not trying to depict them kind of realistically so much as their particular stylistic, but it's very well proportioned, laid out.
They did a lot of work to preserve these things.
Oh my goodness.
Because I can't imagine they would look this good.
Although mosaics are incredible, the worst thing for mosaics is earthquakes. Because it can be a disaster.
You think about when they were done.
Yeah.
Like,
So colorful. They mosaics wear a ton better than fresco. They're one of them, because if you think about it, it's colored rocks, right? So it's colored rocks or glass that it's not going to fade. The biggest danger to it is that it's gonna deteriorate and fall apart. So as long as the main thing is as long as you keep the moisture, but what's good about this part of the world, there's not freezing and thawing. It's like this area, I always, like where we live is like the worst place in terms of preserving anything, because we have a lot of water and we have a lot of freezing and thawing. And you add water plus freezing and thawing, forget it. I mean, you can put something concrete, steel, whatever you want. If you don't take care of it like diligently, you give it a couple decades and that thing's busted to heck. But it's not that way everywhere, right? And you see things especially well preserved in deserts and in areas that are more dry. And Italy tends to be pretty dry, and tends to be very mild climate. So a lot of things have been able to be preserved there that in Northern Europe you wouldn't see it preserved nearly as well, for example. Certainly not up in like Russia and up in the northern parts of Asia. But all that being said, this is now, of course, the Commission of Belle Arti in Italy, like the state, the Italian state, these are national treasures on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So like, there's a lot of resources that go into preserving these mosaics and other works of art today. The Hagia Sophia, this dome was the largest dome in the Christian world, for 1,000 years.
big is that dome?
I don't have the exact dimensions, but you can see. So what you see is kind of you see that basically as you have the initial style of kind of basilicas with apses, these Romanesque arches, and then you start getting more and more ornate. You start building out, and then you start kind of putting dome on top of dome, on top of dome, on top of dome, and you get this kind of almost like this like beehive, kind of like it's kind of a wild, very organic, kind of like complex. This is what it looks like now. Of course, the Hagia Sophia was when it was invaded, it was kind of turned into a mosque and then a museum. I've heard actually that there's rumblings of going back into a mosque. I don't know.
I thought it was back to a mosque.
It might be back to a mosque already. I
My
think.
husband and I were there about,
Oh,
I don't know, 7 years ago, and we actually went to visit my brother and we flew Turkish Air, and we had this like 4-day layover in Istanbul. It was really, really interesting. It was before Erdogan came to power, so I don't remember
Yeah.
how many years that was. I don't think I would go there now, but we went there. It was fascinating. It was beautiful, and they had started to, the Muslims had painted over all the faces.
with lime, right? With like
and they're a bunch of Italian, when it was then not a museum, when it became a museum, the Italian restorers came in to try to restore some of
Right.
those depictions and the faces, and so some
like
of them were,
that one.
yeah, and it was beautiful, and I don't know what state they're in now.
This is actually a 13th century mosaic of Christ. Very famous. You probably recognize it. It's called a Deus mosaic or divine, but sometimes you also see it referred to as the Pantocrator, is the all-powerful. There's also so this is the oldest. So I wanted to show you. So you have certain themes of iconography that start to develop. This is actually much older than that mosaic. This is newer. But the oldest known image of Christ, Pantocrator, is in St. Catherine's Monastery in Syria, and that I think it's like this was it's an interesting icon that was done in molten wax with I was like, jeepers, how's that last? With a tint added. Of course, a lot of icons would be with egg white, right? Egg white with a tint. Then we refer to them as being written rather than painted, and it's a prayerful, meditative process. But yeah, and I didn't include it, but there are other icons or other mosaics in the as well. Beautiful architecture, beautiful church. So you can see, as soon as Christianity was legalized, the biggest things people were building in Christian countries were churches. And that was where the resources were. Like, if you wanted, if you were to look at, like, okay, where's the art from, like, in 13th century Turkey? It's iconography. Like, that's what all the artists are doing. It's not like you had, now there might have been some, but it's really even pretty much later when you start getting into like portrait kinds of things. Or there's not landscapes. Nobody was painting landscapes really. Like, that's later. It's religious themes and religious iconography, and the architecture similarly. there would be palaces and things, but there was, when you think about today, right? This is something that I often think about. You know, if you were to look at like downtown here, it's more, to me, it's more pronounced when I go to a city like New York City, and you look at like St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is now just dwarfed, right, by all of these massive skyscrapers, billions and billions of dollars into real estate that's for the purpose of, like these buildings are corporations. It's all commerce. You can tell what we worship in this country. And that was not the way that it was at this time. I think in many respects, it's interesting. You can go back and look at the history of the church. You can trace it by looking at what people wrote. But I actually really think that there's something about going back and looking at the buildings people built and the art that they created and which buildings they built and where they built them and how they built them and what kinds of art they created to put in those buildings and just in their homes. And that to me says a lot more than what somebody wrote down, because they lived in these spaces. And it's really, but there's, again, you know, like this kind of looks, it's an interesting too, the two eye, like that you could, like people have done all kinds of studies. This side looks like kind of mad Jesus, this side, you know, people, there's all kinds of, like, this image is very, it's just a very interesting image, and it was done, it's intentional, and so that could be a whole evening, just this image, to really, with somebody who like studied it. Anyway, so again, that connection over to Venice, right? Because Venice was also very influenced by the East. And again, when there was this shift, now a lot of this was added later, right? A lot of the ornamentation, but St. Mark's, San Marco, and that's why you see all the lions everywhere in Venice, right? Mark's Gospel, the lion being the icon of Mark. You can see, especially inside, just the significant Byzantine influence, right? There's a lot that looks like, it's very reminiscent of the Hagia Sophia, like, but in smaller dimension. And with some interesting like this kind of, this is more basilica, right? Like kind of Romanesque. So there's an interesting Byzantine, but also kind of like, well, we are in Venice, so. And of course, this is all resting on piers of wood that are sunk into the mud.
Speaking of moisture.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you go to Venice, and you know, many times there's like seawater coming into this building. It's remarkable that this thing was begun in 832 and is still standing. And the amount of work those crazy Venetians, I mean, thank God they were so rich they had enough money to spend on keeping these things. But there has been, I don't even know how much money has been dumped into trying to keep these buildings from sinking into the ocean. It's really pretty remarkable. But you know, again, you just see the real. It's an interesting thing, right? You kind of, when you start getting it, it's like everybody wants to add their little thing. So you start getting a bit of a hodgepodge with some of these. But there's something to me that seems very healthy. I don't know if you find this, but if you walk into a church and like everything is exactly of the same era, the same style, like you can tell like it was all specified by the architect down to the T. There's something about that that is kind of disconcerting. This is clearly the fruit of a community over time, right? And a lot of different people kind of like, my mom died and we want to do something to honor her, so we're hoping we can put this cross. We have a buddy who works for this, glass, thing over here. And you can imagine like half the people in there are like, what is that ugly monstrosity? It doesn't go with anything. And then the bishop's like, oh, it's fine. They're a nice family. And everyone's like, whatever. And then a couple centuries later, or not even, a couple decades, they're like, well, nobody can take that down. That's been here forever. And you're sure like there are stories behind these things that they reflect a community that's living and generous. And creative, right? And there's something very healthy about that.
I'm thinking of the original workers. I bet they gave so much time. And you wonder about the stories, like even you're a great sinner. But if for the next 2 years you commit yourself to working on this.
Well, working or paying for somebody else to work on it. I mean, I think, part of, we tend to think, for example, that we live in a time that doesn't have any artisans. But I would suggest to you that we still have a lot of very quality artisans, very capable artisans today. But they work on private projects. One of our parishioners is an interior designer for yachts. Do you think, like, these yachts that are $100 million? Do you think that somebody just throws that together? You better believe that there are people who are doing like inlaid wood paneling of very high caliber. But nobody's going to see it, and it certainly isn't to the glory of God. I have a little bit of experience. I used to work as a landscaper on the Rockefeller estate in Falmouth. And just along Route 88. It's like your classic thing where you pull into a driveway, dirt road for the first half mile, then it turns into pavement. You get to the end of it, it's cobblestone, opens up into $1 million view. And it's like the heated granite pool with the tea house and the rest of it. I just saw somebody bought a house down in Naples, Florida for like $110 million in a state. Right? So, but the thing about a church is the poor homeless person off the street can go in and enjoy it. The poor homeless person off the street's not going in to enjoy your custom-built tiki bar that somebody slaved over. I think sometimes we have this idea that like there can be a kind of moral superior. Oh, we're so much better than people used to be, but and some of it was selfish in the sense of people, but there was a sense of kind of civic pride and responsibility, like, but also like and it can be disconcerting, like to the modern mentality, it's like, because you go in and you see like some of these names like plastered all over some public monument, and it's like, well, why that? Jeez. But it's like, well, they plastered their name on it because they wanted to know that they were generous, and they put this big fountain, like the Trevi Fountain here, so everybody could enjoy it. Well, that's a little bit better than like dropping $200,000 on your kitchen that nobody's going to see, or your master bedroom suite that is just for you. My dad does home inspections for multi-million-dollar homes sometimes, and it's like 2 people living in it. 6-bedroom house with all kinds of square footage, people rattling around in a building. Nobody's going to enjoy that. Who is that serving, right? It doesn't serve. It's not a service to the community. So it's not to go after people, but it's to say there was something. And if you look at the architecture, even like this, the era of this being built, you build these big hospitality spaces. Even back a century ago, 2 centuries ago, people built, and you see these huge palaces, and people spent so much money on social spaces, spaces that were meant to bring people together. They spent very little money on bathrooms, kitchens, bedrooms.
Kitchens they don't go. They didn't have any.
Yeah, although, they were, but it was not a priority. The private spaces, you can tell that it was their own personal comfort was not the priority. That wasn't where they spent the money. They could have, but they didn't. You can go back to ancient Rome when that period of decadence when they were collapsing, and you can find the Roman emperors spending a lot of money on bathhouses and their private palaces and all their space. But that was not this era. Middle Ages are the era of piazzas, right? Of huge public churches which everybody can go into. Right? And that's what they were thinking about. They weren't just creating art for themselves so they could sit there and think about how wonderful they were. They were building things to share and to be able to really build up the whole society. And I think you see this come to an incredible kind of climax. And again, there's, and people can be very dismissive because there was a kind of weird, it was a kind of fun competition you see in the Middle Ages when these city-states start growing up, and they're like, who's going to have the biggest cathedral? Who is going to have the biggest cathedral? This is Siena. And this cathedral, this area over here, was supposed to be a whole nother wing that was going to be like, this thing, they didn't get to finish, but like this thing was like crazy. Crazy. And it's a neat church, huh? But again, just the amount of attention, time to build something beautiful to the glory of God and for people to come together and to pray in and to spend time together in. And, this is not the fruit of a particular 5-year capital campaign. This is the ambo, right, where they would proclaim the gospel. So you kind of walk up because it's before amplification, so you come out, they would put the ambo in the middle of the nave, and so you'd process down from the sanctuary to the ambo, and that's where you were kind of more in the middle of the people, and they could hear you better. This is this is beautiful, right? Beautiful, beautiful work. All of this, the floor, you can't do it justice. The floors in this are just crazy. All this inlaid marble and stone, and there's a lot of civic pride, right? Because Siena is white-black, that's their colors. The whole thing is white and black. These are the floors. So just you don't do this overnight. It's time, and it's everybody kind of like, well, I'm going to add my piece to this, right? And I want to do something beautiful. And also just, if you don't have that kind of patronage of the arts, you're not going to build the kind of skill that can even do this, right? Like, you don't, and I think that's one of the challenges today is that we don't have as many artists in some respects because, we tend to value quantity over quality in some respects. We're going to, there's, if you want to get a nice piece of furniture that somebody does by hand, that's a lot of money. And so there's a real challenge when the economy has kind of just become industrialized. It's very challenging for artists. I think it's made it much, because somebody who does this in the church, you better believe they're doing a lot of stuff that was a lot less complicated to pay their bills a lot of the other time and to learn the trade. Like, this is the capstone of their work. But they had to do a lot of other work to get to this point, right? So there's a whole culture that is supporting craftsmanship and the development of the trades, the guilds, everything else. You don't get to this from just kind of in a vacuum, put it that way. Of course, Assisi, San Rufino, this is, again, about the same. So many of these are 13th century. So many of these huge cathedrals are 13th century. San Rufino, this is the crypt chapel, which is beautiful. These are all Giotto. Unfortunately, it was hit by an earthquake. Church. Again, these are all Giotto. They just set the guy loose. He went to it. But a lot of this looks like, this I think may have been taken, I think this was taken before the earthquake. The earthquake, unfortunately, knocked a lot of these frescoes right to the ground. It's like people were crying because they came into the church after the earthquake and the frescoes are just lying on the ground. So that was really brutal. This is the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, which is probably, in terms of high Middle Ages fresco, this is the high point. Just a beautiful, again, they just set this guy in there, I don't know, like, go to it. And you see just the kind of, again, there's Giotto is something else. He, there's a style, a kind of iconic way that he, you can see it's not Renaissance, right? But there's a kind of, he captures a lot of depth. He was just a remarkable artist. He's my favorite, I have to admit. I love Giotto.
Giotto's O?
No.
Well, the Pope asked him to come to Rome to paint for him. The Pope sent his man to ask Giotto to come to Rome, and he was asked for a sample of his work, and he just drew an O, a perfect circle, and that's what he
Yeah, that would do it.
Anybody who can draw a circle this perfectly worthy of this commission.
Yeah. It's really, just, it's remarkable, just the way that, and we have these hundreds of years later, you wonder, like, when Can you imagine being there when Jota comes over and like this thing is fresh paint? Like, must have been just make you want to cry right there. To see somebody who's just so capable. These cute little details. This is Fra Angelico, huh? And he would be another real. He's buried in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is a church in Rome near the Pantheon. And I would always. It was actually on my way to the university. It was a shortcut to cut through the church. I'm on my way to the Gregorian. I'd go through the front of the church, walk through the church. Hi, Jesus, bless us. Then I'd go out the back door and just keep going because it was like right on my way to school. But on that path, the tomb of Fra Angelico is right there. So I'd say hi to Fra Angelico on the way too. But he was in Florence a lot of his life as well. And if you go to the San Marco in Florence, one of the neat things, you go in and all of these monastic cells that were there with his fellow Dominicans, he went through and gave everybody their own fresco. Each one of the cells, and it's always a cross. This one's unique because usually he's crucified. But like everybody got, it's like he spent years just going from one cell to the next, painting frescoes of the crucifix, our Lord crucified, or different people, different variations in each room. That's what he did. Well,
Was it Fra Angelico who escaped from his cell a few times? Got in a bit of trouble. I don't know if it was him or a different.
I don't know. I mean, that very well may have been.
I know there was one. Painter.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, and of course they were so prolific. You see, there's Fra Angelico work all over the place in Italy. Really beautiful.
There's a big retrospective coming up in the fall.
Is there?
Yeah, in the fall through, I guess, the winter. Yeah, in Florence.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
I did a big one at the Met
Okay.
20 years ago. Just amazing work.
Yeah.
And that place.
Well, and what I was just, I mean, at one point, like, you wake up in the morning and be like, oh, nice image. Thank you. Thank you, Fra Angelico, for decorating my room. You know? It reminds me of, I was staying in a Swiss monastery for a few days on a road trip. We stayed up in the Alps, and we were staying in these monastic cells that were all, like the whole wall was like inlaid scenes from the scriptures. The chair was like hand carved. You didn't want to sit on it. And then like the bed, all not a big room. And then it was this huge ceramic tiled stove with all like hand painted ceramic tiles. And then the floor was like these huge slate block. And then you get into this bed with its like some big poofy duvet. Go down for breakfast and it's like, I mean, I was like, these people know how to live. They've been doing it for a while. But just that, again, you think about like, you've got a monk who's sitting there just, and I think this is the other piece, one of the, it's hard, a lot of the a lot of the there was something also about in the Roman Rite, right? We have celibate clergy, and there had been not just clergy, but celibate virginity was highly prized for a long time, and is, you know, until very recently we became suspect of virginity. That really freed a lot of people to be able to dedicate themselves to a broader good for society. Whether that be charitable works, you know, you think about a lot of the religious who did incredible things for society, but also so much of the aesthetic, the music, the art. It's not easy to do these kinds of things when you're trying to support a family. And the church held up this kind of service, and it was not considered, you know, if you think, I remember when I was home, my parents were doing they were replacing the foundation under the house, and they had they had a kind of a Mennonite minister came over, and he was operating the skid steer and working on things. So he has a business, he has a family, et cetera, and so he's the minister, and so he knows I'm kind of the priest, and so he starts in not so subtle ways, kind of like inferring that how can you run a church if you don't have a family, if you don't know what it's like to be a father? Like, basically, you're not a real man if you're not married. Like, and if you think about it, in Roman society, in a lot of societies, and I think to a degree in our society now, if you're a woman who, like, the last thing in the world a woman wants to be is a cat lady kind of like thing, where you're like a spinster. Those are not like titles of endearment. You know, and even like the way that I'm so tired of people talking about the nuns that beat them. I'm like, well, what about the nuns that taught you, took care of you, took care of your parents when they were sick and dying? Like, what about those nuns?
There was an editorial or letter to the editor, this was quite a while ago in the Portland Press Herald, it was just about this, and it was a woman who wrote in and said she came from Canada, and she said that their parents couldn't take care of them, so she and her brothers and sisters were taken in to, by the nuns, and she said, I really liked it. They were nice to me, I was warm, I had enough to eat, nobody was drunk, nobody fought. It was, I learned to play the piano and to sew.
Right.
No, she was like, I thought it
My
was
grandmother was from French Canada, and same, like, they ran a lot of boarding schools that, they were just, there's been so much good that came from men and women who were given, not just, it wasn't just, well, you're not a suitable partner for anyone, so I guess you can be a nun. It was that it was elevated and respected in society, such that a woman who had aspirations and had a sense of her own dignity, this would be something she would pursue. It wasn't just like, well, go to law school or go to, not to pick on law school.
Feel free.
But, I think even my own mom, like, she's bright, everything else, it was like, well, go into medicine. Like, that was what you were. Then it was not doctors, because that was guys, but it was physical therapy. That was like the professional. If you're a bright woman, you became a physical therapist. And, so, how often, now we're pushed toward career, but at the same time, it's like everybody is supposed to be able to balance everything. And I think that this is one of the things that a lot of people are struggling with in our society today, is they've got families, even just 1 or 2 kids, but then they're trying to do this whole career thing, and they're being stretched really, really thin. Whereas if you gave people a dispensation to actually feel dignified in not getting married and to have community without being married, which is what religious life does. It gives you community. It gives you somebody who's going to take care of you when you're dying or when you're sick, and make sure you're not on your own, because you need that. But it also liberates you to be able to serve broader social needs and not. Whereas raising children it's a lot of work, right? I mean, and there are people who are really good at it and need to do that, but not everybody. And I think that that's part of what gives you this, frankly, is that you have a good chunk of society that's not raising their, and what we got now is everybody's raising their like 1.2 children. It would probably be a healthier society if you had fewer people raising more children. And let people who are not really called to that, are not particularly inclined to it, let them have dignity in serving God in a different way. So, anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack. But one of the things about creativity is you have to binge on some of these things. It doesn't work well. Creativity doesn't always work well with children, because if you're in the middle of doing one of these frescoes, and little Joey comes up and needs his diaper changed, it doesn't work very well. Right? Like, there are certain things that just don't work very well. You only have so much time. That plaster stays wet for only so long. And there are certain, I know this. My poor staff, sometimes they'll come into my office and I'm like, I have to be focused on what I'm doing right now. You're coming in like this? I'm like, no, get out of here. Because you can't do anything like this if you're all over the place. You can't. You can't do anything of quality if you're being drugged in 50,000 different directions. And that's what it means when you're raising kids. So anyway, I'm making my case for celibacy. But I think there's a complementarity to it, right? There's a complementarity. We need healthy, good families. But let's not elevate this to say, unless you have found your partner, somehow your life has no meaning. Or you're not undesirable and you failed at life because you didn't find a partner. I mean, that's the Disney narrative, right? And I think it's especially horrible for people Avery's age. They've been fed that since the minute they were born. Your whole goal in life is to find your other half and walk off into the sunset to live happily ever after. And if you don't do that, your life's over. You're miserable. It's going to just stink.
That's why so many people end up in relationships that aren't successful. Because they settle.
Right.
They
Yeah.
think they have to.
Whereas you could be working on something really cool like this.
That picture taken in 1260?
No. But I think
That was pre-restoration.
this is pre-restoration, yeah. And what's crazy, look at the number, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
1260.
Sort of feels like that when you're inside though. Well, not now, but before.
1260. You're building something like this in 1260. I mean, that's just, it's astounding. I have minimal tolerance for modern arrogance. You look at the Hagia Sophia, you look at this and you're like, okay, yeah, we figured out cell phones, but when's the last time we built something like that?
We know the treacherous
I heard, yeah, they were, and kudos to them for, and I think that's Cologne. Now, what's interesting is, look at this one. Started in 1238, completed 1880. This is where I'm like, don't rush me, people.
Was that damaged during the war?
It might have been. But you know, again, like, this is Chartres. 1242. I mean, these are all like, I mean, this is, when you look at the number in the 13th century, the number of the, I mean, it's like, people call it the Dark Ages. Like, what are you talking about? Right, what are you talking about? There's nothing dark about it. This is a little later, Duomo in Milan, the Milan Cathedral. This church, they took forever, and all, they say that it's never going to be without, there's always staging somewhere. Because you got to take care of this.
You should be glad you're not in charge of that one.
I mean, but look at like, look at how crazy that is. That is crazy, flying buttresses.
So is there a lot of public money that goes into these?
Oh yeah.
Too? There must be, right?
Yeah, they're pretty much funded entirely by the state. They have to be. This is inside.
Well, they're just humbling spaces to step into. With those standards, it's, you can just feel God.
Yeah, there's a real, there's a real, just, I think there are spaces that embrace you and give you dignity. You clearly do not build something like this for pigs. Pigs.
That's what I thought you said. Okay.
Like, pigs will not appreciate this.
So you're not allowed on any marketing department.
But I think that this is part of what there's something, and especially, this is where sometimes people say, the church spends all this money on architecture and all, and it's like, well, okay, but back to my other point. People spend trillions, billions and trillions of dollars on skyscrapers that are only for certain elite people who can get up into certain floors and into certain executive suites, and how much is spent on exclusive neighborhoods and bedroom communities, and you build a church like this, you spend money on this, the homeless can walk in and it's for them. So, and exactly like, whose church is it? It's not like the church is spending this money. It's not like anybody owns it. It's not like it's somebody's private bedroom. It's for everybody. How many billions of people have seen this ceiling? Right? I think that's where the criticism of the church's expenditure on sacred art and architecture is just completely out of line. And it's really, it would be different if we were exclusive about it. If we weren't letting people into those buildings, unless they hit certain economic thresholds, or if they were the right race or the right this or the right that. But they're for everybody. And to think that all human beings need in this life is food and shelter, no, we need beauty. It's dignifying. And especially poor people, people are being trampled upon, who are living in miserable conditions, whose work is in miserable cubicles, who don't have dignified spaces that they can afford to live in. This might be the only beautiful space they walk into in a given week because they're working at Walmart, and then they're living in like some prefabbed house, and like all the spaces that they're in are really just kind of not great. Manufactured, generic, functional spaces. This might be the only space they walk in that actually they have that sense of being like, huh. Somebody told me that I was having a construction consult yesterday about a project, the Welcome Center we're doing. And I was saying, yeah, it's a little crazy downtown Portland. She's like, but it's so peaceful walking in here. Not Catholic. She was like, I just feel very peaceful here. It's like, yeah. Like that's what it's supposed to do. Right? Peaceful and humanizing. You look at, you all probably, most of you probably seen this Sistine Chapel. The unfortunate thing is when you see it, you're probably surrounded by 80,000 million people, and they're all going, Silencio! Silencio! My brother he's a spoiled guy. He would a few times he get pulled in, a scholar from the seminary got pulled in to sing for private tours of the Sistine Chapel. So there would be like 10 people in this room. And that's a whole different, he says it has phenomenal acoustics actually. But what's crazy is this was painted by a man who said he wasn't a painter. And he tried to refuse the work. And it's crazy when you think, now this front part was Bramante, but the dome was also designed by Michelangelo, right? Wow, I'm blanking on the word. What's it called? Colonnade. The colonnade is Bernini. And you're probably aware it's meant to look like a keyhole. You can see that. So, this is, think about just the phenomenal talent of someone who can design this dome, who can paint the Sistine Chapel, and so this is the design. I don't know how many of you, I've walked up inside of this dome a whole bunch of times. It's very fun. I've actually run up it a bunch of times. So we're to be able to, this is not, this is incredibly complicated. Massive scale architecture. You have to know an obscene amount to be able to design something like this. Michael?
Is that like the Duomo in Florence, the dual domes?
Yeah. Same thing. Yeah, and you go up here, and you can see, you get up, here's the railing, and but you walk up, and you're going, by the time you get up here, you're kind of doing this a little to get up. But this, right from here, is an incredible view down into the nave of the church. And I think they're still filling niches at St. Peter's, right? But this is really the height of Renaissance, no, not without controversy. I told you, the Baldacchino, they stole the bronze out of the Pantheon, so Bernini could build it. But But just a remarkable, I mean, if you've been in this space, it's the closest thing you ever feel like you're outside, but you're inside. I think it's like the scale of this building. That's what I've found too in, when you look at this facade. If you look at it from far away, it doesn't look that big. Until you start, when you get up here and you are like this person, and you look at this column that's like, it's like the width of this room. And you're like, holy mackerel, this is huge. But it doesn't look, because the proportions are so well done. The proportions are really remarkable. So this was Michelangelo's, like, really one of his first public works that he did. So he does this, does the Sistine Chapel, does St. Peter's Basilica Dome. Same guy. That's crazy, right? He was so ticked off, he signed, you probably know this story, he signed his name here. He regretted it his whole life. It's his only work of art that he signed. He thought it was arrogant.
You were like 23, right?
Yeah, I was young. Young. He was incredible sculptor. But I have to say, I think it's arguable that Bernini was better. This is Bernini's work. This is in Piazza Navona. These are figures that represent the 4 great rivers of the world. But like, this is Saint Teresa. I think it's the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, right? That's marble. This is like, to give you, this is at the Galleria Borghese. That's marble.
What is the sculpture that is a woman, but it has a veil over her face in marble? I can't imagine.
And these last ones are Bernini.
These are Bernini. I mean, I don't know how to feel like it's just, I mean, it's phenomenal, right? Like, it's just the amount of, I mean, you just.
So what kind of life did these people have before they did this artwork?
I think they just did artwork.
Like Dad wasn't a trash truck driver, like
No.
how did they learn this stuff, right?
I mean, part of it is it didn't come out. I think a lot of it is in order to achieve this level of skill, you have to have 2 things, I think, at root, or at least 2, but a couple of them are. The first is a whole lot of humility, because you have to learn at an early age a lot, and you have to repeat. Bernini copied. This is how these sculptors learned, is they would take a master work and they would try and duplicate it. And they would do that again and again and again and again and again. And so they did a whole lot of non-original work before they ever embarked out on their own. And that's how they learned how to do it, by copying. And so they were able to build on the shoulders of the sculptors who went before them, because they learned by copying them, and then they were able to move and take the art form another step forward. And a lot of them also, they had to be very collaborative, because a lot of Bernini's work, I mean, you look, he just did a ton of stuff. He had a whole crew. So, you know, and Michelangelo as well. I mean, they had a whole bunch of people that were working with them. They would select the marble. It said Michelangelo would look at, he could see the statue in the block, right? But then you're bringing, there's no way you can think about all the logistics involved. You got to get marble into a shop. You're just carving huge chunks of marble. Well, these guys, they had a crew helping them do that, right? So you have your apprentices are just doing a lot of the rough work. With something like this, you're bringing in, your apprentices are doing a lot of the work to get you to a point where then where Bernini is coming in. He's guiding the whole process, and then he's coming in at the end and doing the final pass. So these were not just, they were not just skilled in their own little bubble.
They were general contractors.
They were general contractors, and they were, they were very insightful about. Part of it, it seems to me, you have, think about Michelangelo doing the Dome of St. Peter. You have to be incredibly good at project management, to be able to, and even to get the marble you need, the tools you need, the plate to schedule things, there's a ton of logistics involved in all of this to be able to make it all work. So, and this is before, sometimes I think now we have kind of like the pure art kind of thing. When you're building a dome, and then you're doing like a sculpture, and then you're doing the Sistine Chapel, this was very broad kinds of skill sets. There's a reason the term Renaissance man exists. So it's really remarkable, huh? St. John Lateran in Rome. Now, what's interesting about this church is that, and you can see, right, these are all Renaissance era statuary, but it's actually one of the most ancient, it's I think the first parish church of Rome that was built in Rome. So there's been a lot of Baroque, it was kind of Baroqueified and ornamented. This is a lot of Baroque Renaissance era ornamentation, statuary. Significant, right? Really significant. But this is the cathedral. This is actually the chair of Peter. This, how Bishop Ruggieri, we have the chair. This is the Pope's chair. People don't realize that it's this kind of pretty simple chair. It's not in St. Peter's. And these are very ancient mosaics. This is really more of the style of the church going back older, the older style. Simple. Here you can see where it got more Baroque, right? But this is, to me, this is like your classic, the porphyry. It's your classic kind of ancient, very simple ancient kind of Roman style. Bless you. Another church that's very similar to St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, where our Holy Father Pope Francis was just buried. Again, ancient structure, 432 when it was built. I have repeated and I heard, and I think on good authority, this is the church where Mass has been offered continuously every day for longer than any other church in the world. since the 5th century. Mass has been offered at St. Mary Major every day. And you can see, right, where all of this ornamentation was added, right? And remember back when I showed you Santa Sabina? It was very simple. Well, that's what it would, that's what St. Mary Major would have looked like at one time. I forget, do you know the technical term for this kind of tracery marble work in the floor? I love it. There's a technical term for it. I like the pattern, and a lot of it, there's symbolism with all of it too. A lot of, anyway, it's beautiful. It's crazy too. You'll be at some of these churches and you'll see like a few guys on the floor, like with little chisels, like pulling out a piece, putting another one in, because churches don't maintain themselves. I think, part of this is we're Catholics of the Roman Rite. So, and this is an interesting question, right? One of the debates kind of aesthetically, and you would run into it with music as well, has been how much do you emphasize Roman and Roman Catholic? Right? In the sense of, so if you were to look at like the Coptic, now they're not in full communion, but maybe like Ukrainian or Ukrainian Catholic Church or Ambrosian or other rites that are in communion. In many ways, there's a very strong tie to. Many of them have retained their liturgical language, so their liturgy is still in Greek or in Arabic or Aramaic or whatnot. Many of them are very tied to particular stylistic forms of. They still would be very tied in. Like if you go to a Ukrainian Catholic church, you're going to hear Ukrainian Catholic chant are chants that have been sung for centuries. Many of them are tied still very heavily into their aesthetic. They're going to build churches that are in continuity with the aesthetics, the architecture of their tradition, the iconography of their tradition, the kind of way that. And I think that if you were to go back, even to until really the Second World War, in the Roman Catholic Church, there was a similar sense of continuing along the lines of a particular tradition. That's why we have a neo-Gothic church here, right? And if you look at a lot of the churches there was neo-Gothic architecture because it was considered Roman. There was Gregorian chant because it was considered Roman. There were other forms of aesthetic dimensions that were culturally our heritage and patrimony, and were considered not to be a burden, but to be a blessing and to be something to be treasured. Now, for whatever reason, I think there has been a bit of an iconoclastic period that we've gone through, right? I think that's pretty hard to dispute. Between 65 and 75, we kind of really decided that we were going to reject that patrimony and that heritage as a positive. And this cathedral went through it, a lot of other buildings. You can see again, you don't need to read what was being written at the time. Just watch what happened to the buildings. The marble mosaics in the floor were covered over with shag carpet, and the marble kind of neo-Gothic high altar was torn apart. The bishop's cathedra, same thing. The ambo, same thing. And very simple, very kind of fashionable design, wood paneling, things that were very dated to the time, such that just 20 years later, they were out of style. And Father Jim Netto came by, and nobody, I think when he announced that the wood panels were coming down, everyone in the cathedral applauded. Like, it had no shelf life, right? There was no shelf life on what happened. It was very much of an era. Kind of this turning on the tradition. But I think it has, the question at this point, and it's an interesting one, is what's the relationship? Because I think clearly there has, we're not also, it becomes a question of culture. Like, so are we supposed to just anachronistically kind of hold on to a particular era of the church's, should we go back and try to all be just neo-Gothic? Everything we do Catholic is neo-Gothic? Or, what does it mean to be Roman Catholic? What's the Roman in Roman Catholic? What is the patrimony? What's the beauty? What's the treasure in that? And how do we keep that from not just being kind of like this soulless tradition that isn't really us? How does it still engage us in our culture and the time that we live? It's something that we're not just kind of feeling oppressed by our past and by a tradition, but we're an active and living part of a tradition that's still continuing, right? It's not a museum, but it's a living thing, a living organism, a living community that continues, that the tradition that we're a part of continues to grow and develop and moving forward. Pope Benedict expressed this in terms of what he called interculturation. So this project of I think in some ways there was the term inculturation, which interculturation is a critique of that. Because inculturation would kind of look at things as if the Roman rite to be Catholic is kind of an empty vessel waiting for cultural content to fill it. So if you have a culture, say you're from the United States and you like rock and roll, if I'm going to have a inculturated Catholic church, then we're going to bring rock and roll into church. And we're going to bring in whatever's going on in the culture, we're going to bring that in. And the church is really culturally contentless in a strictly inculturate, when you look at it as being the strict kind of goal being inculturation. Pope Benedict, in bringing up the term interculturation, wanted to emphasize that the church doesn't come to a culture contentless. So, and I think you saw, like my brother played that one piece of music that was, I think, in Guatemala, it was like chant, but with like Guatemalan drums, right? And I think that really expresses the idea of interculturation, is that the church, as a community of faith, claims as its own a particular patrimony that has been handed on to us through a particular community, i.e. the Roman Rite, over the centuries. We claim it as our own. Like, St. Mary Major is our church. Like, our community of faith built it. So it's our heritage. And we claim it as something that's important to us and that we appreciate and that we want to influence us. And we want it, it's like a relative that you want people to know, you want your kids to know about. But at the same time, we're not going to go back and say every church needs to look like the St. Mary Major, right? So we're going to take from what has been handed on to us and then try to build upon it and move and have that dialogue with the world that we live in now. And And that in that interculturation, in that mix of, and I think this is where I was pointing out to, when you see the most prolific kinds of artistic work is when someone's like a Bernini or a Michelangelo, they're not starting something brand new from scratch that everyone's like, how in the world did you come up with that? That's not these guys. They're taking something that they know very well because they've replicated it hundreds of times, and they're taking it another step forward. And I think that's really, when you look at that's the beautiful thing, right? When you look at some of these most beautiful works of art, they don't come out of nowhere. They come out of somewhere. They rarely come out of nowhere. Because you can't, as a human being, get to the height from on your own. It's never just the fruit of one person's labor. And I think that's really there's a cultural humility that says, as a Catholic, we have a culture, and to learn how to appreciate that culture, that's the only way that you're going to be able to build upon it authentically. Otherwise, you're just going to be kind of trying to do things from zero, and you won't get very far on your own. What is it? G.K. Chesterton says, tradition is the democracy of the dead, or something like that.
And Joseph Conrad says it's truth manifold in one, connecting the dead to the living and living to the unborn.
Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful?
So it's not, there's a humility in, I think in our world right now, we have gained a certain humility, maybe, in understanding the importance of considering the universal church horizontally, all the diversity, appreciating the diversity of the church. But I'm not sure that we've always gained it vertically in time. It's important not just to consult the people who are living. It's also important to consult the people who are dead. And that's tradition. And to honor them and what they contributed, and to also be thinking about the people who are going to come after you, and to think about what you're leaving them. And that's to see yourself in a line that isn't, you're not just in a single snapshot of time connected to people all over the world. You're also in a snapshot of time. You're also in a continuity of time over the course of centuries that is connected to people who lived long before you and will live long after you. And that's really important to consider too. Caravaggio. This guy was a bit of a fluke. He is a crazy man. He killed somebody and was on the run for half the time he was painting. I think I only was able to get one of his, I had to stop. I couldn't, it's just remarkable, right? This is the chiaroscuro is the name of his way of painting, with just this very, you can always tell where the light's coming from and the shadow. Just remarkable. We see this, but again, in end of the 16th century, so very early. I mean, just really, he painted fast, like hours to do these paintings. And he was often just kind of on the run selling them as he went. He ended up dying, of sunstroke on a beach. He drank himself silly and died on the beach of sunstroke in Naples. I mean, it was like this tragic death. Just kind of all out, out there. But and he was like kind of notorious. I think one of the, like he used like well-known prostitutes as models for like certain, like for like the Virgin Mary and things like that. So he caused some controversy in his time, but he was quite a guy. And I think this is the other, so there's the interesting controversy about tradition and the role of tradition. How do we, what's our relationship to our own tradition? That's an interesting question. I think that's something that we need to be really thinking and thoughtful about. Another important question is, what's the relationship between morality and art? If Caravaggio is a murderer, can we still appreciate his painting? That's been a recent controversy. There's the Jesuit sculptor whose work has been covered over or different things because of his accusations against him, and it looks like he did some pretty horrible things.
It's not the same issue with Columbus. Is it similar to?
I mean, to a degree, although
Columbus did some bad things, but the good things he did were.
Although I think that's a slightly, because that involves evaluating his character and his legacy. I would say with an artist, you could go even further and say, okay, what if I admit that his legacy as a human being is pretty bad? Like, what is it, Wagner? I mean, wasn't he a Nazi sympathizer? Everyone has good and bad traits, but like the question is there a threshold where someone is bad enough that you shouldn't that there's something that taints their creative output, their work?
No, I don't think so.
The world, though, right now, seems to think that there is. There are people who there's a lot of pressure, and bishops have acquiesced to having, for example, this guy, why am I blanking on his name? It starts with an R, I think. Anyway, Rupkin, something. To having his work either taken out entirely or covered. Rupnik, thank you.
Well, it's different than the church displaying it as an institution than somebody appreciating it and appreciating the beauty of the work. Isn't that different? I think it's different.
It's interesting. There's a chalice in our sacristy that I pulled out and I was looking at. I was like, wow, this is a beautiful chalice. And the bishop was there, Bishop Dealey at the time. And because it's kind of a unique chalice. And I was looking at the bottom and looked at the name of the priest, and the bishop was like, Mo. The priest who had owned it, who it was made for. And it's like, well, we shouldn't be using that one. What do we do?
Exists on a spectrum, though, because if there were a watercolor that was painted by, this is cheap, but by Hitler, for example, would any of us really want to look at that? Maybe they exist. You can look at them in books. Would you want to own it, display it in your house or in a holy place? It's a difficult question. That's an easy case, I think.
You can still look at it and appreciate the beauty of it. And in a way, the fact that it's made by somebody who's done horrible things, it depicts that, almost makes it, I'm not going to say more beautiful, but more complicated, right? Which is kind of wondrous in a way. Because nobody's totally good or totally bad.
It's an interesting, I mean, I think we all kind of especially in our time, we tend to create caricatures of people where you kind of have the villain or the caricature of the savior. But kind of to your point, most people are kind of a lot more of a mixed bag. I think maybe where I would draw the line would be like if you had that watercolor in your house and it didn't say it was unsigned, or if the signature was not easy to tell, and you just had it there because it was a nice scene of a pond and lily pads. Well, that's one thing. On the other hand, if it's got a big signature right, Adolf Hitler, or you put a big plaque on the thing, Adolf Hitler, well, then it seems to me that what you're actually appreciating is not the art, but the man. And the man is actually more important than the art at that point. And then you're like, well, okay, why would I honor Adolf Hitler? But that's not. I mean, if you think about like Rupnik and some of these other things, what's the objection is not to the art. It's not that the art is obscene, right? It's to the person. And so insofar as the art can be appreciated on its own terms without being, I guess the question for me would be like, if in the very act of looking at it, if I come up and I look at this, I don't know who made this. Well, what do I care? Who made it? I mean, this could be painted by Stalin. Fine. I don't know. It's a beautiful painting of Our Lady and John the Baptist and Jesus. If it was painted by Joseph Stalin, I don't have it up here because it was printed by Joseph Stalin. Right? I mean, I have it up here because it's Our Lady, Jesus, and John the Baptist. Now, if on the other hand, it's clear that I put it up there because I'm a Stalin fan, and it's kind of like, well, then we get but it's, but
You can't separate the two. You can't separate the man from the art.
it's not easy. Well, at least in our current time, right? Especially when we kind of live in this time of saying, if you appreciate something that is tied to a person, then that means that you somehow are endorsing the person. I don't know that that's a Christian moral principle, though.
But doesn't it sort of like throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Isn't that seems a little antithetical to the whole idea of the possibility of redemption? Because if somebody has the traits in them that allow them to create beautiful artwork, even though they do or have done terrible things, I mean, they're not a total throwaway. That's one of the big points, right?
I think some of this discussion really exposes the reality that our culture is maybe not exactly Christian. It's a kind of, there's not, and I think we would kind of, what's interesting is many of us have imbibed a kind of secular mercilessness and we think of it as being morally superior to shun and ostracize those who have done evil. And I'm not sure that's particularly Christian. I'd say there's actually good reason to think that it isn't. Especially after they died. Like, we're not even talking about, it's not guilt by, it's not like I'm going, if I've got a painting that Hitler or Stalin did on the wall, it's not like I'm out there, buying it from him and supporting his cause, right? I mean, this isn't, so I think the thing becomes a matter of, It's an interesting discussion, though, right? The relationship, and it's not a new thing. And you see this happen. What's one of the things that happens in a lot? If you go through some of the Italian villas, like the Villa Doria Pamphili, beautiful. It was a private villa owned by the Pamphili family in Rome. You go through and you go into some of the outdoor gardens, and you see all these statues decapitated. Because when they came in and they overthrew these families, and the state seized control of these estates, there was an animus, and you see this many times, that art can symbolize the owner or the creator. And so it's done to remember that big scene when we went into Iraq and they toppled the statue of Saddam Hussein? There's this iconic moment. So there's a kind of, but is that Christian? I mean, just because it happens doesn't mean it's Christian.
Well, it's interesting because some of the things that you look at and you really like, you don't know anything about the person who made the work.
Well, and I would say that there's one of the interesting things about the way that Christians have operated. So if you go to Rome, you go to a lot of these piazzas. What's in the middle of the piazza? An Egyptian obelisk. Why in the world would you put an Egyptian obelisk in the middle of a piazza if you're a Christian that has like weird, funky Egyptian things on it? God knows what kind of spells. Not only that, but the obelisk that is in front of St. Peter's Square. That obelisk. That obelisk used to be over here, where the circus was. It was in the center of the circus. When they built the first basilica, the Constantinian Basilica of St. Peter's, they relocated it. It was in the middle of the circus where Peter was crucified, upside down. This obelisk may have been one of the last things he saw. What's interesting about it is it's in the center, it's the center of the keyhole. And in this there's an urn here in bronze on the top. And there's a relic in that urn, and it's a relic of the true cross. So what's the Christian response to evil? You put it in the middle, and you put the salvation of Jesus Christ, you baptize it. You say, what do you do with a pagan temple? You put a church on it. You don't just turn it into dust. You take the different columns and you put them all around here. What do you do with pagan celebrations in Northern Europe? You have, we're going to celebrate the birth of Jesus on this day. What do you do? It's an interesting thing, right? And it comes from, what did Jesus do? He came not to destroy, but to save. How do you save something you've destroyed, or you've annihilated, or you've canceled, or you've exiled? You can't, because you're not in a relationship with it anymore. It's dead to you. How do you save something that's dead to you? You can't. That's not a Christian response. That's not what this is kind of really antithetical to that, right? If Jesus operated like that, he wouldn't have done that. So it's interesting when you think about it, but and this was not in my notes, the passion, death, and resurrection has bearing on how we interpret art with regard to morality. If God could bring new life from the crucifixion, he can bring beauty from a sinner. That's kind of interesting. And maybe that's been part of why we've been able to be so prolific artistically, because a lot of artists are sinners. Let's be honest. Some of the people who have been most productive and prolific and contributed some of the most beautiful things to the world have not had all their ducks in order. Right? It's not always been pretty. But the church hasn't written them off. At least we're a little more likely to do it now. And it's because of the darn insurance companies. It's true. There's a financial penalty to associating yourself with sinners today that there wasn't always in the past. There used to always be a penalty socially to a degree, but I think now it'll hit your bottom line.
In the case of those Rutnick paintings, and that's a difficult case.
It is. I mean, I don't like them because I think they're ugly.
Yeah.
But I would take them out just for that reason.
There are a lot of people. I believe there are many people who've been alienated from the church because of the last decades, right, and the scandals and so on. And in that environment, I think persisting with Rutnick's paintings isn't particularly helpful.
Well, I mean, and then again, like, part of the question is like, okay, now if I'm going out and selling like prints of his paintings, I think we might say, well, that's promoting. But to take a further step of removing,
There must be some sensitivity, sense of responsibility for those people who have been alienated, rightly or wrongly, right, because of their perception of the church as an institution or the hierarchy in it. And surely that has to be balanced against this need to forgive the artist for his sins. And that's a difficult case, though. That was highly publicized and very controversial. But I hear you. There is.
it's very hard. I think we would have a hard. I think in some respects the same logic. The 10 apostles could have sat down with Peter and said, look, we love you, but you denied Jesus 3 times. That really alienated a lot of people. How are we going to be moving forward with you as our leader? I don't know. I wonder if that line of reasoning is, again, we take our cues from the gospel. And I think we need to be careful about, just because someone is offended doesn't mean, and just because they're struggling, is the struggle that they're having with the artist alleviated by us taking that kind of action, or is that just inherent to the evil that that Rupnik caused? Right? Does it alleviate the person's suffering? Should we just say, look, that's part of what Rupnik did, is made it difficult for some people to view his art. That's part of the damage. And so some people are going to have a really hard time looking at these pieces of art because because of what he did. But that's it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I have any. I'm not saying that I would go. I mean, look, if we had somebody's painting up here that was, I don't know.
But the truth is, and I think you made a really good point earlier, I've got art in my house that I think is beautiful, a couple of pieces anyway, and I really don't know anything about those artists.
Right.
They may have done something 10 times worse than Rupnik.
And even the ones that you know something about, you don't know everything about them.
Of course. Of course.
So, that's a hard question.
It's, one of the, I think that this is,
Also not the church.
Yeah, well, that's.
but this, to me, the hardest thing in the church, morally, is the question of scandal. Because there are many things we know Jesus condemned and said were absolutely wrong. However, giving scandal is not one of them. Because he gave scandal. He intentionally scandalized people. He was known for his scandalous behavior in spending time with prostitutes and tax collectors. And so I think when we as a church community start making decisions on the basis of scandal, we have to be very careful, because that's one area that we know it's not clear because of the example of Jesus Christ. I feel far more certain on things like murder, adultery, theft, uncharity. Like that, to me, that's pretty straightforward. But the moral argument about giving scandal, that's very tricky. For a Christian, I think, very tricky.
It seems almost like the conversation particular to art, because I'm in like book sorting mode and I'm thinking of it, and I think that it's maybe a little bit different in that way, because art is maybe more open-ended, I don't know, than books, because like I think of authors who, even if they wrote something that isn't specifically bad in that text, just the name of that author and who the person is, they shouldn't have, I wouldn't keep that or promote that, recommend it to anyone.
Really, just based on their name?
Yeah,
What about like Thomas Merton wrote Seven Story Mountain?
that's a little bit different. Like I think of James Martin to be a little controversial. Like I think that I do not feel comfortable with someone like that. I would never say, oh yeah, read some of his books. I don't know. Sorry if anyone likes it, but I think that even just that name is loaded with a little bit of.
Again, though, I think even that, again, the question becomes like, how do you,
Do I put that on a display in a bookshelf?
you're going to get,
Because I think that.
but here's where does it stop? I think this is the kicker, right? Is if you don't judge, if you judge the book by the cover, if you don't judge it by the content, if you don't judge the art by the art, but by the creator, if you start going down that road of weighing the social reaction to or perception of, now you've really moved into a proportionalist and consequentialist kind of moral calculus, which is not Christian moral reasoning.
But also, don't you have the who decides problem?
Can't we separate the decision, can't we make a distinction between, the decision about whether to display art from the decision about Rupnik's soul, which isn't ours to make anyway? The only Christian response to Rupnik is to pray for him.
Sure.
Because we don't know, and it's not ours to judge. But do we have to apply that same approach to his art and where it's displayed, given that his art upsets some of our brothers and sisters. That's,
I mean,
I think it has to.
yeah, I don't think the question of judging his personal moral culpability, I don't think that's ever really should be in play, right? I think we could all say that's not in play for a Christian. But I do think that you do run into the question of like what happens when
I apply that standard to myself. There were a few times during the COVID thing. I'm involved. I'm a litigator, and I did some pretty high-profile cases. I sued the governor. I sued her cabinet. My point of view on some of those COVID mandates offended a lot of people, including people in this parish. And so I actually checked in with the bishop, and I said, "Listen, I'm supposed to be reading this Sunday. I've been in the news. Is that okay? I don't want to upset anybody. People should be thinking about me when they come to Mass. They should be thinking about what they're hearing. And I don't want to contribute to a distraction. You see what I mean? I don't want to get in the way of what's supposed to happen in Mass, just because of who I am and what I do professionally." I think that some thinking about these issues doesn't mean that you're not being Christian if you.
I think that's right. You want to be smart about some of that. I do think though, like, so for example, I think that's a reasonable thing to consider on your end. But if, for example, if I were in the pews and is it a healthy dynamic for me as a person in the pews to be looking up the personal resume and professional life of everyone who reads?
Well, it was in the newspaper.
No, but what I mean is like, to what degree? So like, should you and I now go and investigate every one of the paintings in our houses to make sure they're not offending some like what level of so you see kind of like the concern is like, well, now somebody might walk in and somebody might walk in and say, "Do you know who painted that?" And then you're like, no. But do you have a moral responsibility to preempt that? So like it gets a little bit dicey, right? In terms of we're on a bit of a tangent, obviously. We moved from art and aesthetics into morality. But it is an interesting question, and I think you could really go. It's not, as I said before, to me, this one is it's probably the hardest I think the most challenging area of moral reasoning for a Christian because of our Lord's example and witness. It would be different if he had associated with people who had stellar reputations, and if he had only gone to places that were considered to be holy places to go. But he didn't. Like, he sat with a woman at a well in the middle of the day, not exactly without scandal.
Right.
He did a lot of things, touched lepers. Like, he just did a lot of things that would have been considered borderline, but really not right, or associating himself with people who are really not doing good. I mean, one of the apostles was a tax collector. Caravaggio has a beautiful painting of his call. So That's what gives me caution on that line of reasoning. And it's not, because frankly, this is the danger, the thing that I worry about is, if I'm a pastor, what is the safer, less risky path for me to take? The path that doesn't involve scandal. So I'm going to have a tendency to take it. I'm going to have a tendency to take down the offending whatever and to say, Ron, don't read this. Just because it's a lot easier for me to tell you not to read than for me to deal with the fallout. But is that just cowardice?
I don't know. You know what the response was when I asked? That's precisely why you should read.
Right.
Basically in keeping with your point. Right?
Yeah,
It's like we don't care about scandal. Get up there and read.
Anybody who reads could have something going on.
Or they could do something the next day. Let's be honest. It's an interesting thing, though, right? And I think, isn't this part of what our culture's really been struggling with lately in the whole question of kind of so-called cancel culture, which is interestingly plagues both ends of the political spectrum, where people who are super identified on the right or on the left want to kind of cancel the extremes on the other end. And I think that that's really an interesting question of what is a Christian approach to this? What are the thresholds? Like, are there thresholds? What does that look like? What's the proper response to scandal?
What parts of history are we currently erasing from view?
Right, well, the Christopher Columbus thing, right? And it's not Columbus Day anymore because whatever. And it's like, well, you know.
Seems to be like a who decides problem. Because once we're deciding based on either sort of a majority or what we think is a majority or our own personal morality, we're kind of trying to take the place of God, who says that everybody is my creation and everybody's redeemable. I don't know, maybe that's too, Pollyanna, but I think it's true.
I think that's an interesting point of who decides, because I think maybe that's part of what makes me a little nervous about some of this is it feels a little bit like a lynch mob. It can feel a little bit like a lynching sometimes, where nobody's really has the authority to make a determination. Like, who decided that Christopher Columbus shouldn't be celebrated on Columbus Day? Well, nobody really. Did it go through some kind of official process? Did somebody deliberately come out and say, we are now officially... No. It basically was like enough outrage was expressed by enough people, kind of banged the drum loud enough that enough people decided that they were going to not observe it, and then that kind of turned into some kind of social movement that then picked up steam and ended up... Well, that's the way that mobs kind of work.
Well, that's kind of like one of the problems with communism is it's the who decides. If you get to keep your stuff and kind of do what you want and be nice to everybody, but if it involves you truly giving up everything, for the good of the state or for whoever else is going to make decisions on your behalf, that's a whole lot different. It's a much different animal.
And who decides, who has the authority to make that kind of decision?
Those who have the power.
Right.
It's an interesting, and that points to maybe, that's an interesting tie in that there's a certain anti-totalitarian kind of vein in the tolerance of scandal. That there's a kind of totalitarianism inherent in this, in the rooting out of scandal, because, and you see this, it's a similar kind of dynamic, right? Like in the French Revolution, it's like, well, you were seen with the guillotine for you. Well, next thing you know, the guillotines turned on the very people who started the whole thing. And pretty soon, who's without scandal? Everybody's done something scandalous. And so there's a kind of totalitarianism. And once that takes root and starts taking hold, where does that end? And that, I mean, we just celebrated Divine Mercy Sunday. And it's interesting to me that that seems to be, in many respects, kind of the antidote to. I was just recommending The Scapegoat by René Girard. Great book on this kind of thing. Scapegoating often is rooted in scandal more than fact. You were seen with this person. Doesn't matter whether you were doing anything wrong or not. You were associated with them. That's all the mob needs to convict someone. And it's precisely from that we have a judicial system that says, no, you're innocent until proven guilty. It's precisely to save you from being convicted because of scandal. How many people now are being tried in the social media court? And there's no innocent until proven guilty there. Their lives ruined because of scandal. So it's an interesting thing. I don't know exactly how to deal with that, but Avery's giving me the time sign. I want to. Serious? Absolutely. Well, I wanted to end with a positive note. That happened quickly. We got on this stupid thing. I know. Well, you know what? This is good though, because I actually kind of it works, because I ended up, I didn't have a chance to flesh out some of these things. I wanted to end with, lest you think that all the beautiful art just happened centuries and centuries ago somewhere in Europe, or in our tradition at least. This is one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the United States, I think. It's French Baroque, French Gothic style, one of the best examples of French Gothic style in the United States. The cathedral in Newark. Nobody really knows about it. Newark, New Jersey. Check out, so this is in Newark, New Jersey. I stumbled upon it by accident.
How old it is? 130 years?
Probably same era as this, probably late 1800s, I bet. I don't know for sure. But it's a beautiful church. It's a really beautiful church.
Is it falling apart?
No, well maintained. They say that the craftsmen who put St. Patrick's together, who worked on St. Patrick's, they all lived in Newark. And so they did St. Patrick's, that was for the people in the city, but when their real hearts were into it was in their own cathedral in Newark. So if you have a chance to stop by, the cathedral in Newark is very much worth visiting. This, of course, is St. Patrick's in New York.
Kind of sticks out amongst all those skyscrapers.
Yeah.
It really does.
But it's a beautiful church in its own right. I mean, we have built some beautiful churches in this country. It's really and the Catholic Church has built some of the most beautiful churches in this country. This is one that Holy Hill in Wisconsin is beautiful. It's a beautiful shrine, and just it's simple, but it's beautiful stained glass, tasteful use of marble. It's a beautiful church. This is St. John the Baptist in Savannah, Georgia. This is St. Jehoshaphat in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is the cathedral in Providence, Rhode Island. This was designed by Keeley, same architect as here. This is the Mission Church, or it's the Basilica to Our Lady of Perpetual Help on Mission Hill in Boston. Beautiful church. They just restored the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston. This is also a beautiful church. This is Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, Missouri. You can see the Byzantine influence on this. Beautiful church. Yeah, this is the outside. It's really a stunning, beautiful church. St. Mary's Basilica in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I lived across the park from there.
That's a huge span.
That is big.
Oh, there we go. That's the end of that. So I want to add, but we have a lot. Like I didn't put in the shrine in D.C. and some of the others. We have a lot of beautiful churches in this country, and we even in this diocese we have a lot of beautiful churches. So and beautiful art, and there's, I think we shouldn't be. We may not be exactly at Michelangelo standards yet, but I think part of it is if we kind of look at things with humility, if we appreciate the people who've come before us and try and build on I think nothing is worse to the creative project than arrogance. Ironically, because sometimes artists are thought to have to be arrogant and just in their own little world and narcissistic and everything. But if you look back, I think you would see that that's not at all what's produced the best art. It's not arrogant people who are just into self-expression. It was people who really had great, deep humility and really saw themselves as part of something much bigger than themselves, and ultimately in working in the service of God. So anyhow, hopefully, I think my thought was at least we can see some beautiful things tonight, feel good about it. It's a beautiful, anyway, think about the whole question of interculturation, inculturation. How do we move forward with what does it mean to be Roman Catholic? What does that mean? What's our relationship to our cultural patrimony? That's an important question. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.